pretzels today. A little note about that, if you have pulled out your calendar and tried to count the days, you will run short. February 18th was Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. If you count 40 days from there, you'll run out of days before you get to Easter. Because Sundays are not included in Lent. The way the Christian calendar was put together, the first holiday that we Christians put on the calendar was Easter, just one annual Easter experience. And then we started talking about each Sunday as a little Easter. And then when Lent was put together, they maintained the idea of every Sunday being a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, count the days, remove the Sundays, you'll get to Easter. There's your trivia for the day. This summer during my sabbatical, Joseph and I took a trip up to New York City. We drove from here to Annapolis, up to Detroit, crossed into Canada, went across the top of the lake, over to Niagara Falls, down into New York City. So the day we arrived in Brooklyn, we were already running late for dinner. And in my family, we have a condition we call PDS, pre-dinner syndrome. So all that bonding that goes so well does not go well during PDS. So we land behind schedule into Brooklyn. We check into the hotel. I have got the plan for dinner. I have assured my son food is on the way. We walk several blocks into the dark looking for this restaurant, only to get there to find that it's closed. Not their business. They don't exist. Confidence level on Dad is going down. PDS is going up. We're wandering back towards the hotel. I'm thinking vending machines and nothing else. When we come across this little pub, and we wander in just to try and grab anything to eat, they end up having these burgers made out of lamb that were just amazing. We had this wonderful meal. So as we're driving out of New York City a couple of days later, we've had dinner at Times Square. We've had pasta in Little Italy. And I'm thinking, Joseph, what was your favorite meal on this trip? It was that little pub in Brooklyn. I don't know if it's because we were just starving and he was so thankful to find food. If you've had journeys with family, you know that there are these moments, these just memorable moments on the journey that happen, and we're just surprised to find how much they mean to us as family. This story is much about a journey. Now, normally, the Transfiguration story is used as a conclusion to the season of Epiphany. Epiphany is a season right after Christmas where we look at several texts that talk about who is Jesus in our life. And in the Gospel of Mark, there are three classic texts. There is the baptismal scene where God speaks and everyone gets to hear that this is my Son, the most beloved. There is the crucifixion scene where the Roman soldier says, certainly this must be the Son of God. And then in the middle is this text, the Transfiguration text, where we hear God again say, this is my beloved. Those are the three classic texts out of the Gospel of Mark that talk about who is Jesus. I chose to use it to begin our Lenten season because it's also a wonderful archetype of the spiritual journey that so many of us go through. This painting, and we're going to look at some pieces of this as we go through the sermon. This was done by Raphael in the early 1500s, and it's a depiction of this scene. One of the most difficult parts of the Transfiguration story is how do we describe what's actually happening? The gospel writer wrestles with that, preachers wrestle with that, painters wrestle with it. How do we describe what's going on in this text? Raphael uses sort of a vertical motif based on the mountain. As you can see what happens at the top and what happens at the bottom. We'll go through that with the sermon. The journey up the mountain, it's a great example for us. Jesus intentionally chooses Peter, James, and John to go up the mountain with him. It's a great example because it reminds us that we don't journey alone. We don't travel through this life alone. We're not meant to. We're meant to travel together in some fashion or another, especially in the journey of faith. We're encouraged to have a community of faith to travel with because of all the benefits that go with that. others to keep us safe, others to encourage us along the way, others to keep us accountable, others to help nurture us along the way, others that we can learn from, others that we can share our gifts with, others that we can serve side by side, shoulder to shoulder. That's how we're meant. Jesus doesn't call one disciple and teach that disciple the good news. Jesus calls a dozen. And then there's others beyond that. The disciples, when they start trying to share the faith, there's another 70 after that. Always calling people into community to share this journey with. Some of you are spiritual leaders in your house. Some of you have the opportunity to choose others to travel with you. In this section of the story, I think the question is asked of us, who will we choose to travel with as we go up the mountain? The highlight, of course, is the mountaintop, right? This is a blow-up of the top half of that painting. To try and wrap our heads around what's actually happening, I'd like to ask the question, how did Peter, James, and John know that it was Moses and Elijah that were standing next to Jesus? We don't read about name tags. There's no formal introduction. Oh, by the way, disciples, here are my friends from somewhere in the beyond, right here with us today. Moses and Elijah joining us. Come on down front. There's none of that. Somehow they just seem to know, or at least the story leads us to imply that. Something is happening that's beyond the five senses. Something is happening that's beyond our ability to articulate, our ability to paint, our ability to share, other than it happened. Hopefully you've had those kind of experiences on your journey. Maybe you were serving in a mission context and you saw how someone else's life was transformed by the good work that you were doing. And in that moment, you could see how God was using your mortal hands to make an immortal difference in somebody else's life. And it's difficult to describe. It's difficult to share with someone that wasn't there what it was like to come face to face with that transforming power of God's love. So the gospel writers are trying to share that with us. Raphael's trying to paint it. It's a beautiful painting. Jesus all transfigured, whatever that meant. Moses and Elijah on the sides, and then the disciples down below in awe of what's happening. The characters off to the left could have been the patrons that paid Raphael to paint it, so they got themselves painted into the story. It could be representing the gospel writer himself who told us the story. I'm not really certain exactly, but those are two of the possibilities. Now that you try to wrap your head around what's going on the mountaintop, there's some noteworthy things that are happening there. One, this is sort of a glimpse of the Jesus we will see. This is the glimpse of the Jesus we will see one day. We have the other gospel stories that talk about the Jesus that walked among us. This is an image of the Jesus that we get to see. And it's not just a Jesus that demands the kind of purity that Jesus demonstrates and displays in this transfigured purity that he is. It's a different kind. It's sort of a public display. This isn't Jesus kept in secret that you can only see if you're good enough. This is Jesus that has invited some disciples that we will see along the way are as flawed as you and I, and they get to go up the mountaintop and they get to glimpse this Jesus that we will all see face to face. And I believe that because when I hear God's voice, it's not God saying, "This is my son, so you best listen to what he's saying." This is my son that I love. This is my son that I love. It's a public display of affection. It's an intimacy that is promised to you. Not as a carrot dangled out there, but in this highlight moment, this mountaintop moment of Peter, James, and John's journey of the faith, they get to glimpse what this is about. And on the way back down, Jesus says to them, "Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody until I've risen." Because it is an experience that's just hard to describe. It's hard to explain, especially when they don't know the rest of the story yet like you and I do. We have the advantage of having read the Gospels. We know what's going to happen on Easter. They don't yet. Imagine they're on the mountaintop seeing this happen before them and they don't know the rest of the story. How would they ever come down from the mountain and tell what's going to happen? But Jesus tells them to remember it because it will stand them well later in their journey. One of the values of these moments in our faith journey is we can hold them like a treasure that we can pull out when the days are dark, and they will shine a light on our world. So after the resurrection, when Christians are being persecuted, when these three disciples are eventually giving up their lives for the faith, they can pull out this memory, and it stands them well. So well that they've shared it with you. This moment when we get to see a glimpse of who Jesus is, who Jesus will be for us, and to see the kind of intimate relationship that Jesus has with God. Right there for you. That's the mountaintop. And maybe the real blessing of this story is not just the mountaintop, but the choice that Jesus makes. Jesus could have stayed. I would. Who would we be to tell Jesus to do anything but that? In this moment, he is revealed for who he really is. He's made this dazzling white pureness with Moses and Elijah. Why come down? But he does. And maybe that's the biggest blessing for us in the Lenten journey. This is the lower half of the painting. This is us. This is where Jesus chooses to go. Jesus chooses some of us to go with him up the mountain, and then Jesus chooses to return to the rest of us on the other side, and here we are at the base. Jesus chooses to leave behind the glory of the moment of transfiguration to return to us. Our bickering and our baggage, our questions and our doubting, our suffering and our pain. You can see images of all of that in this. That man lifting that son who looks like he's twisted and maybe possessed or sick or something. Something's gone wrong. That woman, do you wonder maybe she's the woman who they were going to stone for adultery and Jesus saved her? Maybe that's her, represented in the story. Or it could be Lydia, who became one of our best evangelists as she was a leader of a house church in the New Testament. Which one is you? Because Jesus chose to return to you. And maybe that's the biggest blessing of this story. Lent is an opportunity for us to take this kind of journey through Lent, where we give up some things to set us free from that tries to hold us back from seeing what's on the mountaintop. It's an opportunity for us to take something on, like Shelley said, take something on to strengthen us, to shape us, so that we can receive the glory of Jesus Christ in Easter on the mountaintop. So that we can have our own mountaintop experiences that we can carry with us like a treasure and pull out when the days do try to rough us up later on. Because just like Jesus made the choice to return to the bottom of the mountain, that's where most of our life is, right? As we're called to love our neighbor, live our life with each other, travel together, serve each other. Thanks be to God that this story was remembered for you and I. Thanks be to God that God knew us well enough to know that the disciples needed this experience before Easter happened to help them continue the journey. Thanks be to God that this story is remembered for us because for each of us is promised these kinds of opportunities if we will take that first step up the mountain. We will have these experiences, and they will stand us well. And we will remember them, and we will do our best to share them with someone else, and it may make absolutely no sense to them at all, except they will see the passion in you, and they'll recognize that. Even if they understand none of the words you share, they will understand your passion. Like the mother that was sitting with her pastor, the mother of a schizophrenic son, whose life was full of brokenness, to an extent that she never always was certain who her son would be when she saw him that day. And she sat there in front of her pastor with a Mother's Day card in her hand and a tear coming down her cheek and a smile on her face, because in that moment, even though her son was not cured, he was healed. Healed to the extent that their relationship was reconciled so that he gave her a Mother's Day card saying he loved her. And that wasn't always something she got to hear. But in that moment, she was given her mountaintop, and she could cherish that card and remember that that's her son that she's going to see made pure and cured one day. That's a gift. That's a gift.